Hello, my name is Matthew Childs, and this episode of The Standard Show is episode 2 of our series Farm to Fork, the relationship between standards and food, which is looking at food production. Now, before you listen, I just wanted to let you know that we have crammed so much content into this episode of The Standard Show that to make things easier to digest, we have split it into 2 parts. This is part 2 of the episode, so if you want to listen to part 1 first, then that is available on the podcast feed. Now, at the end of part 1, I've been speaking to Tom Holland from Raynor Foods and Jason Cresswell from technology firm Sweetbridge about a digital transformation project called the Digital Sandwich, after having enjoyed a tour of the sandwich production site and seeing how real sandwiches are made. In this part 2, we start with Cindy and I still at the To Love Tea and Coffee House down the road from Clapham Junction, and her asking me about my visit to Raynor Foods and about those real sandwiches.
So after all that, Matthew, did you actually manage to eat a sandwich?
I did, 2 in fact, an all-day breakfast and a chicken, and very good they were too. Now, listening to Tom and Jason talking there about the issue of traceability and applying the technology to a sandwich was fascinating, wasn't it?
It was.
And not just in terms of all sort of raw materials that goes into the product, but all the different data points that could be included. They're potentially endless, really.
That's very true. And I was really struck by what they both said about we usually viewing the supply chain as something linear and following a straight path, but actually it's much better to think of them as a network with everything and everybody being connected.
Yes, and that got me thinking. So stand by for another Douglas Adams reference.
Okay.
Now, it's been a while. I think the last time we talked about this was on the Smart Standards episode.
Yeah.
Now, then it was The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. This time it's another Douglas Adams book, Dirk Gently's Holistic Detective Agency.
Go on.
So this character, Dirk Gently, is a detective, but he uses holistic detection to investigate and solve cases, which is based on the principle of the interconnectedness of all things. According to Dirk, everything is connected. So, to solve a case or find a person, you need to investigate the entire situation, the whole situation. What this means is that everything he discovers, everything he touches, and everything he sees will eventually come together to solve the case.
Okay.
It probably works better on a page, doesn't it, really? Now, anyway, from Dirk Gently and the interconnectedness of all things to someone who's been involved in the development and use of the whole thing. And that whole thing is a standard, ISO 22000 for food safety management.
Yes, Matthew spoke to Amanda McCarthy, Global Food and Beverage Manager at DNV Business Assurance, a Norwegian company based in Oslo but operating globally. Amanda is responsible for certification in the food and business sector, working with ISO standards and other private standards for food safety. She has enjoyed a long-standing career in quality and the food sector. She's also a standards maker, chairing the BSI Standards Committee AW90 Quality Systems for the Food Industry.
I chatted to Amanda about the ongoing relevance of food safety for consumers and ISO 22000, a standard which she has had a personal and professional relationship with since 2005, a standard that she describes as beautiful. She started by telling me about her standards journey and how she stumbled into standards, well, by mistake.
Okay, well, it's actually a really interesting story. I find it interesting. I don't know if the listeners will. But straight after graduation, I joined a dairy company, Express Foods, as a management trainee. And the day I went for the interview, Express made a bit of a mistake. And I wanted to go into production, but they put me with the quality director and interviewed me for a quality role. And I was totally unprepared for this because actually it wasn't what I wanted to do. And so I thought, well, this doesn't really matter. I'll just wing it in the interview. And the quality director said to me, you know, what does quality mean to you? And I just blagged my way through it because I knew nothing and I was totally unprepared. But I got the job. And that was, you know, that's where I started in quality. You know, it was an accident. And I started my career from that point in quality and in food and in standards. And at that time, Express Foods was at the forefront really of quality assurance in the food industry. And I became quality manager at a cheese factory. and we implemented BS 5750, which some of your more mature listeners will be familiar with. It's a precursor to ISO 9001. And at that point, the BS 5750 food safety management, quality management systems was really used in engineering and in sort of heavy manufacturing. It wasn't actually in food, and we became the first certificated site in the food industry. So that was like a massive thing, that we were able to adapt this standard to use for food manufacturing. And then at the same time, we were also leaders in HACCP.
Clarifications Corner. A hazard and operability analysis, or HACCP, is a technique used by risk assessment teams to identify potential hazards and problems with the operability of a system or process.
And some of my colleagues at the time in Express are now, were then and are still now global experts in this field. So I really was I was among giants when I was just kind of a young quality trainee. I was really working with the best in the food industry, and then quality kind of developed into quality and food safety, and we needed standards that met the requirements of the industry, not just for quality, but to ensure safe food. And at this time, there was a lot of legislation around food safety coming along in the UK, and then also in the EU, in the US, and in other countries. And it was obvious then that, we needed something more that was specifically about food safety. And so ISO 22000, which is Food Safety Management System standard, was published in 2005. And I was very fortunate. I mean, obviously, the whole story for me has been a lot of firsts, because I was very, very fortunate. I became the first ever lead auditor for ISO 22000 globally. I conducted the first ever audit, and then the first ever site to receive that certification was this site that I had audited, and they were Westbury Dairy in Wiltshire, fantastic site. And I was really, really proud, and not only to do that audit and to be the one that was involved in their certification, but actually to kind of be involved in this great site, actually implementing this brand new standard back in 2005. And now, I'm now at the position where I'm delighted to be the chair of AW90, which is a BSI standards committee for food safety management system standards. So that's me in a nutshell.
That is you're right. That is a wonderful story. I absolutely love that, and I think I want to come back to 22,000 and the work of your committee. But before we do that, we sort of joke on the podcast about how people have been seduced by standards and then end up never really leaving, and they become steeped in them. But I think you kind of stumbled into standards, yes. Really, didn't you? You kind of by accident you ended up getting involved in quality, but now you've ended up chairing, as you say, AW90, the standards committee. So tell us about the work of the committee.
So the committee feeds into the international committee TC34, which is the ISO committee, which is responsible for updates to ISO 22000. But I think of course, the BSI committee has no more authority than the other national committees working with this standard. But I think because the standard was originally conceived and developed in the UK, we've got a very special interest in its development. It's kind of like our baby, and so we care about what happens to it more so than maybe other countries where they've kind of just acquired it when it became an ISO standard. But I think we do have this sort of concern that it goes well and it develops and it's utilised. So and it's been busy because though it was published in 2005. It wasn't revised until 2018, so that was a period of quite a lot of activity for the committee. And then this year we're looking at the standards that are related to the implementation of ISO 22000. So the standards that are used by certifiers, and they're due to be published. That's ISO 22003 parts 1 and 2. They're due to come out, I think, in June. And then we also get involved with application guides, with explanations of the standard. And then currently there's a lot of work on sector guidelines. So there's a lot of different work. And because ISO 22000 is a standard for the whole of the food chain, right from kind of farmers right the way to retailers and everything in between, we have made sure that on our committee we have people that are representing all the food sectors. So literally from farm to fork and everything in between and associated services. And these people have great experience over many years in these sectors and are representing us also on various international working groups. So, yeah, that's what we're doing. We're very busy.
Now, in terms of, you've mentioned there that 22,000 was first published back in 2005 and it had that revision in 2018, and there's more work being done now around implementation. But sort of take us back, really, or take us sort of inside this particular standard. You know, why is ISO? What's the importance of ISO 22,000 food safety management?
I think going back to ISO, going back to 2005 when it was first developed, the reason for it needing to be developed and being so important now is still exactly the same. It's about providing safe food to consumers consistently, and that's essentially what it's designed to do and what it does. I mean, when you think about food safety, it can be a matter of life or death. There's still many cases of illness due to microbiological, physical, chemical, or allergenic contamination of food globally every year. And often, regrettably, people do die because of something they have eaten. So that's why it was developed, and that is still why it's important and why it's so widely used. And the beauty of ISO 22000, as I suggested before, is that it was designed and developed to help businesses throughout the food chain, from in all different sectors, and it helps them to identify the hazards with the food that they supply and to implement a food safety management system to minimize the risks. So it's now used very successfully throughout the world, and I think it's difficult to kind of have the numbers because it's kind of how can you prove that something hasn't happened? But I've no doubt at all that it's prevented many cases of food-related sickness and death, and that is in its most pure form. Really, it's about safe food. And that's what it does.
Yeah, I want to come back to sort of see if we can explore a bit more about the use. But before we do that, just sort of maybe pick a particular organisation within that particular food chain you've talked about there. So how would an organisation go about using it? I'm thinking in terms of what would have happened before. So they have this standard now. What is changing about through their practices by them adopting it?
So there are legal requirements for all food business operators to have HACCP. So that's hazard analysis critical control points. And as you probably know, that came originally from NASA. What happened with NASA when back in the 1950s, when they were looking to ensure that astronauts didn't get sick from food that they were taking on board for however many months. So everybody has to have a HACCP plan in place where they're identifying the hazards and they're putting in place mechanisms to control them. But they didn't. If you put HACCP in, you haven't necessarily got the management systems in place to ensure that is implemented correctly and consistently and monitored and improved, and and so you need to have that kind of the belt and braces management system in place to enable you to do that. So when you're implementing ISO 22000, the central point, the very first thing that you do is you actually conduct your hazard analysis and make sure that you have identified the hazards in your process, in your product, and that you've got those steps, and that is key to getting everything in the right position. And then all the other bits around it really are just the management systems that are fairly typical to other management system standards, management responsibility, corrective and preventive action, internal audit, training, competency, all these things that you need to actually ensure that you are keeping the HACCP plan live, and that you're continuing to review, and that you're managing any changes. But yeah, I mean, it's just ensuring that the HACCP plan isn't just a piece of paper, that it's actually living, breathing, and being monitored and measured and improved upon, and any issues that you have are being resolved.
I'm interested in what you said there about sort of it's providing that framework to ensure that something is being done. And obviously this is applicable for those working in the food sector. I just wonder, given I think you wear this hat as well, how this aligns and reinforces other management system standards. And in particular, you mentioned there 9001. Sort of how do they work together to reinforce each other?
Well, I think when I talked earlier about the fact that the standard was only just revised in 2018, and I think one of the reasons why it was revised is because of the new high level structure, and wanting it to be consistent and aligned to ISO 9001 and ISO 14001, so that you could have this kind of integrated management systems approach. But actually, ISO, as far as I'm concerned personally, ISO 22000 is practically the perfect standard anyway. It just had to be altered to kind of fit in with other things. I mean, it's a very kind of elegant standard, and I think the fact that it was created basically from scratch in 2005, just taking a kind of a combination of ISO 9001 and HACCP, and then making it generic enough to meet the requirements of all organisations across the food chain. I mean, it really is, well, if you can call a standard beautiful, I'd call it beautiful.
I think you're involved in it. You can call it whatever you like. I think beautiful sounds good to me.
I mean, to come up with something from scratch that meets all organisations across the food chain, regardless of their size, their complexity, whether they're indirect or direct, and it stood the test of time to not need to be revised for the first 13 years of its life, and then only to need to be revised because it had to reflect the new high-level structure. I mean, it's kind of designed to be future-proof. And changes to legislation have happened. There's working practices have changed. There's increasing threats in the food industry, such as food fraud. Pressures on supply chains. We hear now with all sorts of political situations now, the impact that has on supply chains. We've got climate change. All these things have a massive impact on the food industry. But ISO 22000 is so perfectly constructed that it enables these challenges and changes to be incorporated into a business's existing food safety management system without having to change the standard. I mean, the standard is perfect, and it's just, but it still allows for these things to happen and changes to occur in the outside world, without the standard having to be continually adapted. And I think because of that, it can be it's there ready to kind of take us forward, and it would continually be successful because it's sort of inherently future-proof.
Just on the, you've talked there about the food supply chains, and obviously we operate in global markets here, and the food supply chain is global. I just wonder how this standard deals with the issue of regulation and food safety in different jurisdictions, because obviously with food, it's heavily connected with food regulation and the law. Just wonder how the standard deals with that, with different rules and regulations around the world.
Well, essentially, it's a kind of it's a given that you will comply with the legislation. So the auditor that is going along to audit to ISO 22000 needs to be familiar with the local legislation, but it's such that that is part of what the food business operator, the organisation, the farmer, the distributor, the manufacturer, whoever they are, have to take into account when they're putting their management system together. So they have to comply with the legislation. That is all part of what they do in putting their management system together. But you can't, if you were having to adapt the standard, obviously, every time there was a new bit of legislation in any country throughout the world, you would be continually updating the standard. That's just, you take the standard, you take the legislation, you take any other local requirements, you take the requirements of all the stakeholders, the people that you're selling to, your customers, the retailer, the restaurant chain, the next person up the chain, and the system has to account for all these things and all these, user requirements and all the stakeholder requirements and all the legal requirements and the local community and et cetera, et cetera. You have to show that you have considered all these external inputs when you're putting your management system together. The beauty of ISO 22000 is that it covers all sectors of the food chain. So it covers everything from farming right the way through manufacturing, distribution, storage, and supporting services and retail. But within the food sector, there are other standards that have basically been devised and driven by specific groups of stakeholders, and they may only be relevant to particular sectors. So whereas ISO 22000 covers the whole of the food chain and is generic and the requirements are identical across the whole of the food chain, because there's so many different sectors with different interested parties, then ISO 22000 competes in some of those sectors with more specific standards that are owned by trade bodies or other interested parties. So the beauty of ISO 22000 is that it covers everything, but it is also effectively in competition with specific sector schemes.
So, Amanda, you've talked about this sort of the sort of genesis of 22000 and how it's been relatively untouched in since 2005. I just wonder where next. Where is the next sort of area of standards development around food safety management?
Well, I think where we're looking at the moment is any guidance that we might need for any particular sectors. So that is active work at the moment on sector guides to give additional support to people that are implementing the standard. So I think that really this ISO 22000 is the perfect standard for people that are wanting to have the knowledge, know what they want to achieve, want to design their own management system, have done their HACCP plan, know where they're going. But if you're kind of maybe a bit more at the beginning of your journey, you need a bit more support, you're not able to work it out for yourself, then within your sector you might need something that's going to give you a few pointers as to where to go. So more of a kind of a signposting, if you like, for your sector. So what the stands committees are working on at the moment with regard to ISO 22000 are these sector guides, and as they're produced, they will come out. So for particularly for the sectors that are a little bit behind the curve, then they're not haven't been implementing food safety management systems for many years, as we have in manufacturing. Some of the more indirect activities related to the food chain maybe need a bit of extra guidance. So that's where we're working at the moment.
That was lovely to hear Amanda describing ISO 22000 as beautiful. And that personal connection she had to the standard over such a long time. I mean, not bad after stumbling into standards in the way that she did. It was also interesting to hear how ISO standards and others developed by the International Consensus and Stakeholder Model have to work alongside and sometimes compete with other standards industry schemes in the food sector.
Yes, and also how ISO 22000 will be responding to those issues with those sector guides. And just to follow up on that, we didn't hear Amanda mention them, but those guides are being developed for things like packaging, transport and retail. Now, from a standard that's been around since 2005 to one that is due for publication this year, and with relevance to an important part of food production, and that is about the people involved. And that standard is BS 25700, Organisation Responses to Modern Slavery. Now, for some insights, I spoke to Alexander Trautrims. Alex is Associate Professor in Operations and Supply Chain Management at the University of Nottingham. He's published widely on the topic of modern slavery in supply chains. He serves as a technical expert on the Council of Europe's Drafting Committee on Trafficking for the Purpose of Labour Exploitation, and he's also a member of the UN Procurement Human Trafficking and Forced Labour Task Force. He's also a standards maker, chairing BSI Committee G13, responsible for the development of BS 25700. Clarifications Corner. Alex is actually co-chair of the committee, alongside Akila Jardi. Akila is Senior Policy Lead for Modern Slavery at Orbis Procurement, a shared service partnership between Surrey County Council, East Sussex County Council and Brighton and Hove City Council.
Modern slavery is recruitment, transport, receipt, and harbouring of people to exploit their labour. Globally, it's estimated that there are over 40 million men, women, and children who find themselves in situations of modern slavery today. The majority of the food that we buy has been through a growing harvesting, production, packaging, and distribution supply chain. Unfortunately, modern slavery can be found at any stage within this supply chain.
Before I spoke to Alex about BS 25700, I started by asking him about his teaching and research interests.
So my personal interests in research and teaching are really in supply chain management and procurement, and I've been working in that area for a number of years. And about 7-8 years ago, I started working predominantly on the topic of modern slavery in supply chains, and I found that really fascinating to research because it really challenges some of the practices that we see in supply chains and the way we manage supply chains.
And what's been your standards journey, Alex? How did it start for you, and where are you now?
So it's been quite an intense journey, actually. So it started with just being approached of whether I would be interested in chairing a committee on developing a standard for organizations to address modern slavery, and we are now pretty close to publication of that standard, and it's being launched late summer in this year. And so there was I think a lot of development of the committee, and that was certainly a really quite pleasant challenge actually at the beginning to think about, who should be on this committee. And reaching out to my own network, but also the networks of the people who agreed to be in the committee, to really make sure we have a wide coverage of the different areas of knowledge and expertise that are needed to write this standard. And I think modern slavery, in that sense, might be a bit different as a topic from other standards, because you really need a much wider area of expertise. And we also wanted to make sure we have practitioners, business practitioners, we have academic experts, but also NGOs on board, NGOs from the anti-slavery movement. So to really get a more comprehensive and holistic approach to how organizations can address modern slavery.
So tell us about this standard then. Tell us about BS 25700.
So BS 25,700 is, the title is Organizational Responses to Modern Slavery. And even the discussion of the title actually, took the committee quite a bit of time, because it was really about making this a standard that goes beyond legislation. So, sure most listeners will be aware of the UK Modern Slavery Act, but also other legislative developments that are happening in Europe and internationally. And so it was very clear for us that this standard needs to go beyond just legislation, beyond legal compliance, but also beyond kind of, beyond managing a risk for an organization, but much more going into an understanding of, how can we effectively challenge modern slavery in businesses and their supply chains. And getting again these wider perspectives from a wider range of stakeholders and practitioners into the standard. So when you look at the standard today, so for example, I think what makes it very different to other standards is that we have a section on vulnerabilities of workers. So why are some populations or workers more vulnerable to modern slavery or bad labor conditions? And that really, I think, is quite different to how we would look at other management problems in a business.
And why has this particular standard been developed?
So I think we developed it really because there is no standard out there. So there are all many guidance documents, as I mentioned, different pieces of legislation and regulation, but there's not really a comprehensive piece where you would say, okay, this is where experts came together to write an overarching standard that could apply to all businesses, and that can be used as a best practice guidance document for businesses to look at. And first of all, to check, are we doing these things? Are we doing it differently? If we do it differently, should we think about maybe doing it in another way, or is there a good reason why we're doing things differently? So really to bring together these experts from, again, academia, business, and NGOs, to help practitioners to make their organizations capable and to deal with modern slavery. And I think when I look at kind of the organizations I've personally been working with on modern slavery, they very often they don't come from a modern slavery subject matter expert background, right? So when we think about food production management, someone who becomes a food production manager is they wouldn't have a lot of human rights training, or they wouldn't necessarily be procurement experts, or they wouldn't be experts in understanding the vulnerabilities of victims. So, but they are experts in food production, right? So it is really kind of accepting that business practitioners have a need for this knowledge that they've not necessarily been equipped with from by other sources, and to give them this guidance for them to kind of look at their production systems and the way they do things, and where that creates modern slavery risks, but also what they can do to mitigate these risks.
So obviously you've been chairing this committee, and you've mentioned a wide range of stakeholders are involved. Could you just give us some examples of who else has been involved in developing the standard?
Yeah, so there's been some fantastic colleagues, really. Many of whom I've worked with before in the anti-slavery movement, but also new people that I didn't know before I was chairing this committee. So it's fantastic practitioners like Helen Carter, who's great expertise in sustainable procurement and modern slavery and procurement particularly. Fantastic academic colleagues like Gabby Gutierrez from King's College or Amy Benstead from the University of Manchester, who got great expertise in this topic area in organizational behaviors and also in auditing. My co-chair, Akila Jardine, who used to be actually an academic colleague here at the University of Nottingham's Rights Lab, and who's moved into a procurement organization now as a policy lead. And also from the NGO sector, for example, Catherine Bryant from the Walk Free Foundation, who have a lot of experience in understanding business needs around the modern slavery topic. And so really bringing these different areas of expertise together is really it's been really rewarding, and I think we're also really grateful for all these individuals that donated their time and and expertise to this standard. This standard was kind of overdue, but when I think when the UK Modern Slavery Act 2015 came out, there wasn't an awful lot of knowledge how an organization should deal with this topic, and I think we've come a long way since. A lot of knowledge has been developed since. Businesses have learned since. They have tried, they have failed, they have tried and found that things are working. So I think we've learned a lot over those years, and there I think really is an important moment to disseminate that knowledge, because usually businesses do not want to be involved in modern slavery, and it is really about educating them and providing them with the knowledge for that they can prevent to be involved in modern slavery in their supply chains, and if they find that there are modern slavery cases in their supply chain, how do we want them to deal with that? So I think there is, as an educator, these writing a standard comes quite naturally, because equipping businesses to be able to deal with modern slavery or to respond to modern slavery is really mainly an education piece.
And in terms of changes, then, I mean, you've talked about this briefly already, but what changes do you hope to see from organisations using this standard?
So I think what I really hope to see from organisations is to really understand this as a bigger topic. So this is not just an annual statement that I need to publish on my website, or a box I need to tick on a tender competition. This is I would hope that businesses take this as an opportunity to learn more about modern slavery and how it actually applies to every business. No business is 100% free of modern slavery, and I think it is really for business to understand modern slavery as a phenomenon, and relate that to their own business, their operations, their wider supply chains, and I hope also really, use that knowledge not just to prevent modern slavery, but also to, question a little bit, how they might do business, or how they might take actions in their business that actually unintentionally cause modern slavery risks at another point in their supply chain.
So I'm just wondering then, in terms of changes then, what changes will this make to food production?
So I think that the difference it's going to make to food production really depends on how much businesses in food production are already doing in this area, and how many new things they can take from the standard to implement. I think the important thing really is that food production businesses understand. I mean, food supply chains have food supply chains have been kind of being considered as a high risk industry for modern slavery for some time, and again and again they are identified as a high risk industry. So I think what our standard really covers is a lot of aspects in there. One is to understand why is this industry of a higher risk. Because that's the first thing we need to understand to see can businesses actually reduce some of these risk factors? Can they how do they interact with their workforce? How do they manage their business, and how does that create modern slavery risks? But also not just the food production, but also going along the food supply chain into the agricultural production. Also really being able to understand where in that supply chain are the biggest risks, and how those risks can be addressed. So I think what people need to know about this standard is that it's a very comprehensive piece, right? So I mentioned we got a really great number of fantastic experts that worked on the committee, and so it's quite a big document. And I think what is important, I think the readers of this standard to understand that particularly if they're working for a small or medium sized company, or might even own their own company, right? This you probably won't be implementing 100% of this standard, right? So I think it's quite a comprehensive standard, and I think I would want readers to have a look at it and identify which of these areas of the standard are the most relevant to me, right? And that will also depend what kind of business you are, and which function in the business you work for. And so don't be overwhelmed by the size, but take the size of the standard as a comfort that it really covers pretty much all the areas that businesses need to know about.
BS 25700, really important standard, that,
Yeah.
Cindy. And slavery, wow. I mean, it's a term, isn't it, that just demands and compels you to sit up and take notice immediately. It provokes a really strong emotional reaction. It certainly does in me.
Me too. Now, details of BS 25700 can be found in the show notes. And there you'll also find information on ISO 22000 for food safety management and the digital sandwich too. And for pictures of Dan's cows and Matthew in his personal protective equipment, including those white wellies.
Love the white wellies.
Check out our social media.
Well, Cindy, we have gone from cows to sandwiches, real and digital, to food management generally, and to managing modern slavery risks in the supply chain.
What a journey.
And a bit of Douglas Adams too. And I got to wear wellies, not once, but twice.
Yes. And for me, the running thread, or sandwich filling,
Very good.
Has been the issue of digital transformation. Harriet spoke about the future of digital transformation and about it being able to help tell the true story of Dan's farm. And I really like that. I hope that through this episode, we've also done our bit of storytelling too.
Indeed, yes, our thanks to Dan Burling, John Royle, Harriet Henrick, Tom Holland, Jason Cresswell, Patrick Jackson, Amanda McCarthy, Alex Trautrims, and also to Sara Walton of BSI for taking part in this episode, and of course to the lovely cows of Chain Farm in Cambridgeshire. In the next episode of this series, we'll be looking at food packaging.
So, Matthew, we should probably wrap things up here then?
Very good. You going to finish that cake of yours?
Yeah, get your fingers up.
Just try a little bit of
No, just because you finished yours doesn't mean that you can have a bit of mine. You have been listening to Farm to Fork, the relationship between standards and food, a series from The Standard Show. Subscribe to us now, wherever you get your podcasts.
You just heard a Stripped Media production.